A very warm welcome to our audiences all around the world. Welcome to our Telos podcast. My name is Sherman, and with me is my co-host, the very good-looking.
Hi everyone, it's Mario, the co-host of the Telos podcast with Sherman. Here's a podcast where we get up close and personal with inspiring individuals. When they tell their story, may it inspire you to write yours as well.
Awesome. And Mario, who do we have with us today?
Well, today we've got Debbie. I've been looking forward to have Debbie on our podcast. So Debbie, maybe you can start off with giving an introduction of yourself.
Sure. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Mario. Thanks, Sherman. Thanks for inviting me. Just starting the vibe. I feel like, I'm in some radio station or, some celebrity place. But thanks so much. I'm just very humbled, very honored to be here. A quick introduction of myself. My name is Debbie. I am married to Norman. You might know him. Pastor Norman is the senior pastor of our church. That's 316 Church. I am a mother of 3 children. My eldest is Joshua, he's 9. Benjamin is 2nd, he's 6. And Kate is 4. So I have 2 boys and 1 girl. I used to work in the marketplace, used to be in one of the top MNCs in Singapore. I thought I was going to retire there. I worked there for almost 10 years. And then the Lord called me out in 2019 to serve him full time. I was saying, no, God, and I ran, but God said yes. And I said no, and he said yes. And then I said yes. And then here I am, basically, 2019 till now. So I am a pastor at 316 Church as well. And I am also the co-founder of Heartbeat Project, which is essentially a movement that champions women and children in vulnerable situations. So that is kind of like a quick summary of who I am, what I do, but I'm sure we'll be sharing more as we continue chatting. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Super. Thanks, Debbie, for that very concise and good introduction. And Debbie, you talk a lot about, let's jump straight into this, right? But you talk a lot about, family, having 3 kids, and what God's put in your heart. Maybe we can start off by, having you share with all of us and our audience, what is your heart for families? How families should look like, and what's really burning within you in this area of family?
Wow, that's a good question. That's also a big question. Having 3 kids is not something I maybe planned right at the start. When we first got married, I thought, okay, we'll have kids, 2 years after we get married. But then I was really so caught up in my work, and to a point where, a couple of years into our marriage, Norm was the one who asked me, are you sure you don't want to have kids now? And I was just so busy climbing the corporate ladder. I was just so much enjoying my work. But the Lord really had to convict me, and the Lord had to pause me in that sense and really exchange my heart for his heart, and to kind of put things on pause and said, okay, I think I want to put things aside so that I can really be a mom and embrace motherhood. We had 1 child. Norm said, okay, that's it, enough. Then we had 2. And then over dinner one day, we looked at a family sitting behind us with 2 boys, 2 teenage boys. And just in that dinner conversation, I said, hey, look at that family, we are going to be them in like 15 years time. And Norm said, a bit small, right? Then I went, oh my gosh. And then, soon after, Kate was actually born. So my heart, I think the Lord has brought me on a journey for families. And even as he called me to start on the Heartbeat Project, really helping children and women who are in difficult situations, he's grown me in that space. So family, children, marriage is something that is close to me. I definitely won't say I have it all, no way near. But even as I think about what's on my heart for families, I think I go back to what is on the Lord's heart for families. Even as I started this whole journey going full time and going to the world, I just wanted to ask God, what is your heart for children? What is your heart for families? What is your heart for marriages? And when I went back to really all the way at the beginning in Genesis 1, and when the Lord created Adam and Eve, that was one of the first beautiful creations that he made, right? And the first thing he told to them is, be fruitful and multiply. And I think in that act of just creating Adam and Eve, having them in a union, and then telling them to be fruitful and multiply, I really felt what was on God's heart was 2 pillars on families. One is marriage, and really one is children. And in that, I saw God's heart for his people, God's heart for the young, the generations. And, as I see God's heart for the generations, I really realize he is a generational God. He is. So many times it's mentioned, right? He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says so many times in his word how, he's going to care for the offsprings. He's leaving a legacy for the generations after generations, and he's going to bless many after whoever, was the great hero of that time. And so I think what's on my heart, or I hope that's on my heart, is really what is on God's heart. And I feel that is really as he reveals himself for the generations. And I think God is a God who believes in parenting. That's why he's Abba Father. That's why he said to Abraham, right, be the father of the nations, not the mentor, not even the prime minister, not even the ruler, not the governor, but he said that you'll be a father of many nations. But yes, as I see God's heart for the generations and future lines ahead, I also see that in today's culture, and I think it's been a growing culture, that so much that's happening around us is in contrast to God's design of family. Because so many things that's happening around us, whether it's in Singapore and the world, is going against his grain of generations in that sense. When we look at the sanctity of marriage, when we look at divorce rates, when we look at same-sex marriages around, when we look at abortion, when we look at premarital sex, when we look at child abuse, it is all going against the grain of protecting our children. It's going against the grain of what God designed marriage to be, what God designed family to be. And I think that's on my heart, that as God gives us families, and as God puts us in families, whether as a child, as a parent, or as an aunt, or whatever it is, that we would see his heart, that he's given us this nucleus family, but his heart is bigger than that. As we care for our family, we need to catch his heart for the generations of family. That means we don't just do things to care for the current children that I have, but I try to push myself to think on, what about my grandchildren? What about my great-grandchildren? What about my children's grandchildren? And to see that God's heart is for the line after that. And so I think that's what's on my heart that propels me to look into some of the matters and issues that he wants me to look for, to disciple the current generation of children, but also to leave something that they can pass down to their children as well. Yeah.
Debbie, how do you marry that with, like a kind of biblical worldview? You spoke about generations, that the Lord takes care of generations, right? And when you started the Heartbeat Project, I'm sure, that is obviously even larger than your generation, so to speak. It's about reaching out to the public. How are you marrying that biblical worldview in terms of the Heartbeat Project? So we just go slightly deeper into the Heartbeat Project. I think it's an amazing movement, right, for people with real stories to tell, for those surrounding unexpected or unwanted pregnancy. So how do you marry that, as in taking care of people even on a wider scale, all right, and making it very relevant in your work?
So thanks for the question, Mario. Really, how do I marry what's on God's heart with the work that he's called me to do, or called me and Norm to do? It's a great question. I think really, as we look into the work on Heartbeat Project, which essentially, like I said, champions women and children in vulnerable situations, the Lord showed us a few pillars that he wanted us to work on. We started first with the issue of life and abortion, which is really how the Lord called me when I was in Israel. I won't go into the story, but essentially I experienced a lot there, and he led me to see his heart on this matter, and similarly for Norm in a different setting. So it started off that way, looking into life and abortion. And as we started this work, telling stories of women who considered an abortion or had an abortion, their testimonies and all that, the Lord also showed us that we cannot just be a pro-birth movement. And when I say that, what do I mean? That means it's not just about keeping the child, because many times the women in the situation, they have to see beyond that, obviously, right? It's very easy to say, keep the baby, but what happens after the baby is born? And really that is where a lot of the grind goes into. And if you look back really in the Bible, what does the Lord say? He says in Psalms, right, that he's the father to the fatherless. He is the defender of the widows. And he asks us to go into the places of injustice. He asks us to go and care for those who are in need. And I think just being able to be that channel to come alongside the women, the children who are in foster institutions, for example, to just be a channel of God's hope, be a channel of God's love to them, to be able to, even if they're not Christians, to point them to say, hey, you know what, we are there for you. You know what, there are people who want to care for you and your unborn child. You are not alone in this. There is a God who loves you, whether or not you believe in him. Can I pray a blessing over you and your child? Can I pray that God's strength will be with you? And even as I speak to women who may not even be Christians, everyone wants to get a blessing, especially when you're in a difficult situation, right? And so through that, I think we see how God uses us to bring his heart to those who are whether in or not yet in his kingdom, to show how children are on his heart, to show that this child, you're pregnant with this child is not by mistake. God knows what you are going through. God has knitted this child in your womb. God doesn't allow us to choose our children, doesn't allow us to choose our parents. He takes this upon himself. None of us can choose which family we're going to be born into. None of us can choose which parent we're going to be tagged to. But he puts in so much effort to literally customize this relationship for every single one of us. And just being able to point them back to God knows what he's doing. He is the creator and he has them in his arms. I think that's kind of how we marry what we know is on God's heart to practical situations when people are in distress or in vulnerable situations.
I love the words customize the relationship. Now, at the end of the day, it really is a personal and vibrant relationship with the Lord. I just want to ask a follow-up question. I think you did tease out a little bit. How do we educate people in general, whether they're believers or unbelievers, right, about the sanctity of life, even if they're not Christians, because if they don't have this kind of a mindset, right, then at the end of the day, oh man, this pregnancy becomes an unwanted inconvenience, it's a disruption to my life, and abortion then becomes an easy way out. So in your work in the Heartbeat Project, how do you guys give that level of support, that level of education on the sanctity of life? How does that come about?
Yeah, that is another good question. You are full of good questions, my friend. So I mean, if you're Christian, of course, I think if you recognize the sanctity of life, there is something in you, the Holy Spirit in you to kind of point you in that direction. But that said, many Christians, even in our line of work, we know are faced with the question of an unplanned pregnancy, or faced with the question on should I abort, and many do choose the option of abortion, even though they may be Christians. But to your question on if they are not Christians, then how do we marry what we know is on God's word? Really, even if we take out the aspect of religion or faith or the Bible, even looking at just science alone, or even looking at the world around us, we can see life in it. Actually, speaking to many women who are in that situation, actually, if you ask them, I would tell you 9 out of 10 would tell you that I know this is my baby. I know this is alive, but I cannot because, and there are all these reasons that come. Many times the question is actually not even about whether the mom or the dad of the child recognizes this is their child. When they test on the test kit, they already say, man, I'm pregnant, I need to do something about this. There is actually a recognition of life, whether or not they like it. And many times in that time of fear, in that time of unexpected news, and because pregnancy in that sense is a ticking time bomb, because the later you wait, you cannot abort, the more your stomach will show, the bigger the baby is going to grow, the harder it is. And because there is in that sense a ticking time bomb factor, decisions are made in a rush at times because they deem the child as a problem. And therefore, if I get rid of this child, my problem is gone. The faster I do it, the faster the problem is gone. But if they actually can take time and allow us or whoever that they're journeying with to just take time to listen, you will realize that it is the many factors. For example, I'm still studying, my mom is going to kick me out of the house, my boyfriend is going to leave me, my husband says he's going to divorce me, and there are all these other factors which are actually the reason for them seeking an abortion rather than this is not a child or this is not alive. And even for those who actually, kind of say, no, but this is a clump of cells, for example. A lot of times I go back to, but they are meant to look like a clump of cells. At that point in time, a toddler is meant to look like a toddler. An adult is meant to look like an adult. And a baby at 6 weeks old in the womb or 10 weeks or 9 weeks or whatever it is meant to look like that. Right? It's just that sometimes in our mind, we feel, because it doesn't really look human. And I have people telling me that I think it's alive when it looks like a baby, but a baby is meant to look like that, Or sometimes some people say, but this is my body, my choice. And I would nicely, humbly say, to be honest, there are two bodies here. right? That's your body as the pregnant lady, and there is a body of another individual that is in you. You have 2 eyes, the child has 2 eyes. You have 2 hands, the child has 2 hands, and so on and so forth. And really from science, even from a DNA perspective, when the chromosomes of the man and the woman join together, a new DNA is formed, a unique DNA. You know, when 23 and 23 meet, a new unique DNA is formed. And that is a life on its own. And so there are really many ways to kind of have that conversation with an individual to say, you know, what really is your concern for you to consider an abortion? Is it really you don't feel this child is alive? Or are there actually many external factors? Sometimes people say, oh, but you know, the child is not yet viable. There's a lot of, you know, many times people say, but even if I give birth now, this child is not viable. And this child is dependent on the mother, right? So therefore, it's my body and my choice. But I would beg to differ. A baby who is 1 day old, most people, or I would say majority of people will recognize it's alive. That 1 day old baby is still dependent on you, right? That 1 day old baby cannot feed himself, cannot, you know, drink milk on his own, cannot walk on his own. He's still as fully dependent on you in that sense as an hour ago when he was in your womb. And so really it's using all these really thought questions to ask back, I think, to have that conversation. And I think the win is when someone is willing to have that conversation and says, I'm going to take a pause. I understand I'm pregnant, but I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to think through this before I make a decision. And as long as there's an opportunity to converse, I think there's an opportunity to show them you can be a great mother. You are already a great mother. And to journey with them on this entire pregnancy and beyond. Yeah.
Super, Debbie. I mean, this is fantastic, what you've just shared. Clearly, you've not just studied this, but you've researched this and you've journeyed with people. It's very clear and evident that there has been very personal testimonies that has led you to such a understanding and revelation. And on that note, Debbie, would you be able to share with us, maybe anecdotally, a story or two, perhaps, you know, of how you've journeyed with someone, you know, and to bring forth really what the real struggles are and what you've learned, you know, through journeying with these people, and for our audiences to understand that, you know, it's not something that's written as a thesis or a paper, but it's real stories that we're talking about. So if you could just bring us through, it would be a fantastic journey, I thought, Debbie.
Sure, I'll bring you through two stories. One just happened about 2 months ago, and another one happened probably about a year ago. Actually, about 2 months ago, Norm and I spoke at a church. It was a youth service from quite a big church, and probably there were 200-300 youths in that congregation. And we were sharing about life and abortion. We spoke, we had a panel that followed after us. So on that panel was myself, Norman was on that panel. We had a lady who is post-abortive, meaning she had an abortion before, telling her story and her testimony. And we had a doctor who stands for life who joins us on that panel. Long story short, after that session, you know, there was an altar call. Many young people came forward. I was very surprised. One of the young men, actually, he's probably like late teens, early 20s. He came forward and he took the mic. And he said, I want to ask all my brothers to stand on behalf of the men, you know, to really identify this is not a women's issue only. It takes two to create a child. And for him to stand in identification of men and you know, what they represent and all that. And so that was a wonderful session that we had. After the service, probably a couple of hours later, I got a text from the youth pastor of that church. And she said this. A 19-year-old girl went up to her after service and said she's pregnant. And I didn't know this. She went up to the youth pastor and said, I'm so convicted by what I heard. I was thinking of an abortion, but I don't want to do it now. I want to keep this child because this is my child. That evening, she asked her mom out for dinner. Her mom found out about the news, was against her keeping the baby. Mom said, no, you cannot, you know, you are still studying. This is so hard. Just abort the baby and your problem will be gone. But she persisted. She persisted. She said, no, I will keep this baby. God gave me this child. I'm going to keep and I will make this work. Long story short, so the pastor texted me and said, pray for this child. Pray for the girl. Over the next 2 weeks, many of us were praying for this. A single mom texted me and she said, Debs, I have paid now you this amount of money. Please pay now to that girl and tell her that she's not alone, that Auntie XXX is praying for her and she can do this. Other people came alongside. Someone donated a card. Someone said she'll accompany her to the doctor and so on and so forth. About 2 weeks or 3 weeks after that, pastor texted me and said, the mom asked the daughter, I want to go to your church. I want to go to your church. I want to know why these people are so kind, and let's keep this child. I want to see my grandchild and we can do this. And I was just blown away. I was just so blown away, because who would know one conversation, to a group over an hour and a half, in that audience was a 19-year-old girl. And she's still obviously pregnant now. The mom and her are journeying, and the mom is visiting church. And I was just blown away by God's goodness and how he could use as a conversation. Any of us can be in this conversation and say, we are going to be with you. When the single mom transferred the money, all she said was, I'm praying for you. When someone gave a card, what it meant, I believe in you. I will stand with you. And the list goes on. Another story about a year ago, I got an email to the Heartbeat Project email account. And it said, hi, I am a Christian. This is my name. I am pregnant. She said, I know God has given me this child, but I cannot keep this child. My boyfriend will leave me. He has asked me to give up this baby. I have already another child from an earlier relationship. I cannot do this. Tell me what you can do to help me. It was a very short email. I replied back and I said, this is my number. Please text me. I would love to see what I can do to help. Long story short, she texted me and we had a few exchanges. And I just kept on encouraging her, send her some verses, prayed for her and all that. And I said, would you be open for me to connect you with Safe Place, which is the work that Jennifer Hing runs for women with, unplanned pregnancies, right? She said, okay, I'll give this a shot. She got connected to Safe Place. I passed on the contact, and only here and there I would text her just to, kind of remind her and I'm praying for her and all that. Somewhere around, I think about almost a year ago, in the morning at 6 a.m., I got a text and a barrage of photos came in. And the text message was, she is here. And I was just like, oh my gosh. She kept the baby. And I was just in tears at 7 a.m. I was just crying. I was like, oh my God, God, she's here, she's born. And that was around, I think, October of last year. In January this year, I went to visit her and I saw the baby. And I carried the baby in my arms and I said, you are so precious. You are here. And I said, God loves you so much. Your life is going to be used by God. And I asked the mom, I said, what made you decide to keep the child? Because you already told me you wanted to go for an abortion. She said, when I replied her and she saw my email, she said she was crying in the office toilet. She didn't know what she was going to do. And she desperately sent out that email, which I replied quite soon after. And she said no one was going to help her. All her friends told her to abort. Boyfriend told her to abort. And she said, but when she got connected to Safe Place, she told herself, no way these people can help me. I mean, they're strangers, right? She said, turning point was two things. One, when she went to the gynecologist a day before the scheduled abortion to say goodbye to her baby, she saw the baby move. And she said, I can't do this. It was like a piercing. And she said, I can't do this. She left the doctor. She called her brother and she said, I can't do this. I can't go for the appointment. But then after that, how, right? If you decide to keep, who's going to care for the baby? How are you going to get help? She said, when the people at Safe Place and others around didn't leave, she said she felt God tell her, they are staying. You are getting help. And she was just blown away. She said, how can strangers want to help me? Someone housed her for 1 year, whole pregnancy, because she had no place to stay. And people just journeyed with her, and she was just blown away by God's goodness. And so when I carried that baby early this year, I was just blown away, and I was just so blown away by God's goodness. Yeah. So those are two stories out of many, but I see God's hand at work. Yeah. His heart for children, his heart for those who are in vulnerable situations.
I'm just blown away listening to those two stories. Debbie, can you share a bit more about, in terms of statistics, right? Because I read something, let me know if this is accurate. In Singapore specifically, right? I read something like, ever since, like, say, the 1970s, something like abortions were legalized in Singapore, right? There have been like over 500,000 abortions to date. So if I was just looking at that number, so let's just say about 500,000, divided by 50 years, we're looking at like 10,000 abortions a year in Singapore. What are your thoughts on this number? High, low, and what can we do as a community? Because this is absolutely, just now in your first story, you said the guy that went up to the mic, this is not just a woman's problem, this is our thing now, right? So number one, speak a little bit about these statistics. What do you feel? High, low? Number two, what can we all do to really come behind this initiative that you guys are spearheading in the Heartbeat Project?
Yeah, Mario, so the statistics are right. The average abortion numbers in Singapore today are about 6,000 plus. The numbers were easily 3-4 times more than what they were when the Stop at 2 campaign happened, which was 50 years ago. And that was when, obviously the government policies now came in for us to clamp down the size of families. So abortion was a lot more rampant then. And a lot of policies came out from there. I would say it's probably one of the most successful actually national campaigns that Singapore has ever had. And a lot of it, if you go back into history, was really what the government felt was necessary at that time. If you ask me, are the numbers too many? Yes. One child lost is really one child too many. What can we do? Like I said earlier, it's really, speaking up about it is one thing. Many women and men in those situations don't know where to get help. They feel like they're all alone. And the Lord kind of gave us this phrase, if we want to see a Singapore or the world without abortion, the answer needs to first come from the church. Because if the Lord says he is the father to the fatherless, if the Lord calls us to help those who are in these situations, we need to be the one to step out first. And the community support is so, so, so important. So many times they feel like they're alone. But imagine if Christians, churches, when I say churches, I mean not just as an institution, but all of us representing the church, just come out and say, I'm going with you to a doctor's appointment, so you won't be alone. Let me get you good food for you and the baby, and not to judge like, oh, you are pregnant and you're not married, or you mean, you had premarital sex, or you mean you're a single mom. And even for those who are already single moms now, not to kind of, stereotype, or not to say, oh, this is what you did is sinful. I mean, there's an area and a time for us to talk about sin and forgiveness and all that. But when someone is already pregnant, I think the first thing is to really just show them that God still loves you no matter what. We all fall into different types of sin, and we make different types of mistakes, but the child is not a mistake. And the church being able to open our doors and says, every church, I want to have single moms in my church congregation. Not to say that I'm promoting premarital sex, but to say, I am here for you. Our dream is that every children's ministry will have children with special needs, will have foster children, because they are part of the kingdom. They are part of God's creation. There are only about 25 churches in Singapore with special needs ministry. And we want to be one of those, because so many times people abort because they're also fearful of medical conditions that children might have, right? Or doctors' prognosis and certain things. And if we cannot show them that if you have this child, even if the child has a medical condition, we are here for you. Come to church. God still loves you. God will care for you. We can say, keep the child, but when the time comes, we're not there. I mean, I often say, when we tell our children, right, that is a wheelchair handicap lot, don't park. But then when a child's in the womb and a child, for example, has 1 or 2 limbs less, we say, but don't keep this child. It doesn't match, We say, help the old lady cross the road. We're caring for someone in a vulnerable situation, then care for the child in the womb. We celebrate Nick Vujicic, but when Nick Vujicic is in the womb, when he was a preborn, did we say, kill this baby, or did we say keep this child? So there's a lot, I think, even as Christians, for us to think back on what is our posture on life, what is really, when we say sanctity of life, when we say God's design, when we say God knit every child, do we really take that at God's word? And will we really cherish and treasure every child? Yeah.
Yep, super, Debbie. I mean, that's really, really powerful. I wanted to just also, steer the conversation in the other side of the table as well, because we talk a lot about the sanctity of life and dealing with unwanted pregnancies and being supportive. I wanted to ask your thoughts about, well, this podcast is about family, right? So my question is around how do we encourage people on the other side of the table that want to have children but struggle, right? And feel, left out, they feel they're struggling, they feel that their family is not complete, and they struggle with this part of life. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in your journey as well, if you've journeyed with people through such situations.
So your question is, what about people who want to have children but don't have children? Is that your question?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. It's a good question. I think first and foremost, and it was just recently that I came across this thought and I thought it was so important. Sometimes we hear in marriages, right? Someone will say, oh, you complete me, right? Oh, Norm completes me. But I think Norm doesn't complete me. I think God completes me. And I think children, as much as I talked about it, they don't complete us. God completes us. When God said two shall become one, he didn't say half and half will become one. He said two shall become one. We are whole as an individual, and our identity is in God, not in whether we have children, not in whether we're married, not in our status, marital status, parental status, and so on and so forth. So for those people who don't have children, and maybe they're like, oh, you always, you people who are parents always support children, but I don't have children. This topic is not about me. I beg to differ. So one, I feel our identity is God. But then back to again, then what is on God's heart, right? And if children is on God's heart, and we are not biological parents, then what can we do to embrace children? And there's so many ways, whether it's I'm sure you have friends who have children, you have nieces and nephews, you have spiritual children in church. There are children in need out there. There are children who don't have families. There's so many ways for every single person to be an influence to a child. And I just told this to a group of young people who came to our home the other day. We had about like 30 young people under the age of 20. They're all poly students who came in. And they're in this group called Poly Revival. And their heart is sold out for God. And as I heard their stories, I told them one thing. I asked them a question. I said, how many of you are serving in kids ministry or impacting a child's life? And a few of them raised hand. And I said, I want to challenge you. All of you should be impacting a child's life. Why? Because your age and your experience and the language you speak, I can't even speak those kind of language. But you know what? My 9-year-old looks up to Pastor Ian's children who are 14, 15, 18. And they are like his, in a sense, somewhat like a hero because they have this connection in their generation, right? They're so much closer. They are friends, they're older brothers and sisters. Everyone can impact children. And I think if we only hold the perception that they have to be our own biological children for us to impact them, then we are sorely mistaken. So many children actually need a voice in their life, whether an adult, whether a youth. I think that would be my encouragement to those who don't have children of your own. Yeah.
Super. Yeah. Thanks, Debbie. I think that's really good. Mario, you got something?
Yeah. How popular is fostering in Singapore? I mean, as just a follow on to that question. I mean, like, is that catching on? I mean, like for people in orphanages, how does that work? Debbie, just speak a little bit about the fostering side of it. I mean, like for those who can't have kids, is it a very viable? I'm sure it's viable. How popular is it? Is it catching on in Singapore?
Great information to share is that we started this work called 100 Homes that was started during Circuit Breaker, I think, or P2HA, one of those. And basically, just before actually, we're watching this show on the plane, Norm and I coming back from one of the trips that we did for True Love Is. And it's called Instant Family. It's full of like F words and F bombs, but it's so good. In terms of its content, it was just about foster families. And we were both crying on the plane. We were like, oh my goodness, God, what are you doing to us? And that was really how God started us on this journey. So to answer your question, there are about 1,200 children in Singapore who are separated from their biological families for many reasons. Some is abuse, some are neglect, some children, parents are in prison, some are ill, and so on and so forth. About 600 of them are in foster families. So there's about another 600 who are living in institutions. And so obviously the goal and the heart behind the work that we do is to move these children into families because God sets them in families, right? They're not meant to be institutions, but in families. So that is our heart. ever since we started at 100 Homes, what we do is that we try and speak on fostering in whatever situations that we can, in churches, in cell groups, whatever it may be. Hold what we call as fostering info session for people like you, when the question that you had, many people have similar questions. Can I foster? What is it like? How long, and so on and so forth. What is our heart behind it? And over the last about 2 years, 18 months or 2 years, through 100 Homes, we've actually seen the fostering rate in Singapore increase by 40%. 40%, because we just saw how the harvest is plenteous. The laborers are few, but the Lord is raising the laborers. As we speak in churches, people are catching the heart of opening their homes, and even if they can't foster, to volunteer, to come and care for these children, to do short-term respite care, and so on and so forth. So there is still much more that can be done. The fostering is still very small in that sense, in terms of awareness in Singapore, but I think step by step we are going to build it now. Yeah.
Amazing. I think that's very critical in really creating the social fabric of the nation. Right, as we start to put children into homes, they have at least a wholesome upbringing, and then become good people, and really creates a good social fabric for any society. It's really, really powerful. And I want to take that conversation a little bit more in the sense of, we face so much challenges when it comes to family in today's world, right? I mean, there are challenges to just the structure of family, to really the parenting situation, to really even as much as having, to look after parents, right? As we have an aging population in many, many societies. But Debbie, from a kingdom worldview, what do you see are the threats to families, and how do you see how do you see the kingdom worldview playing its part, and what is this kingdom worldview for families that is on God's heart? You spoke about it briefly earlier on, but could you just really lay it to the people, lay it to our audiences, what your heart is in this? So number one, the threats that families faces today. Number two, really, what is the kingdom worldview we should put on to be able to overcome some of these threats?
Yeah, I mentioned a bit earlier that, I do see some of the threats that are coming in from a cultural pressure, but also from, as I converse with many children, I teach the kids' church in our church. So I do interact with them, and I hear conversations that are happening. I think the sanctity of marriage is definitely one big piece. With the sanctity of marriage, what does that look like? With the sanctity of sex and sexuality, how that is going in many ways kind of contrary to how God designed. These are, I think, topics that have been there for a long time, but maybe many times we whether it's as individuals, as parents, or even as church, don't really address it as much. I think the whole LGBTQ conversation is a big piece. What does that look like? And in relation to families, how does same-sex marriage look like? We see what's happening in the West. We see many laws. We see even many churches in other countries who are saying okay to same-sex marriage, and we bring it back to Singapore context. Is the Singapore church ready? Is the Singapore church speaking up on this? Where is our stand on this? And back to families, what is our stand as parents on this? When I hear parents say like, oh, no, this is a political matter. This is, let the government settle it. I really, I just want to have a conversation with them and say, this is not just a political matter. I tell you why. About 2 months ago, I was teaching our kids at kids' church, and I teach the lower primary. And I was teaching on Genesis, I think 18 or 19, on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in that conversation, I asked the children, so, what do you think was a sin that they did? And one of the kids raised their hand, even as I was talking, right? And then so some of them threw out answers, oh, they were bad people, they were gay, and all these kind of things. So I had to, kind of stir the conversation, and I used the right language and all that. But what struck me was one of the child in my class raised the hand and said, Auntie Debbie, just a few weeks ago, my friend asked another friend, are you bi or are you straight? And I was just shocked. I was like, you are in lower primary. Where did this question come from? And I asked this child, is this friend of yours your classmate or an older child? And this child said, no, my classmate. So I was like, so what was your friend's answer? Oh, the friend, I said, I'm bi. Then, other children were chattering, what's bi? So some of them knew, but some of them didn't. But I was just like, you are 9 and below. Why is this? And if parents don't even realize that, dude, these are happening in our schools and our conversations, and obviously we are not there, right? So, for parents who feel that, our family is settled, we all understand we should be one man, one woman and all that, right? Do your children understand? Is it something that you have actually spoken to your children about? Or are you just assuming that because that's the Bible say, or because that is kind of the norm still now, that they have the right worldview and perspective? And so, these conversations, even the conversations on abortion, an 11-year-old was sharing with me, her classmate went up to her and said, why you talk about abortion? It's okay. If somebody don't want this baby, then just don't want this baby. And that sparked out this 11-year-old, no, that's not okay. And they had this whole conversation, and so our children are talking about these conversations. And as parents, as, aunts and uncles, as adults, we must hold on to the power of first mention. Have that conversation with our children first, because why? If we don't, they are going to be discipled by what is around them. And I'm not saying that put your children in a bubble, because you can't. And honestly, you shouldn't. Why? Because if you're called to be salt and light, if you're called to be the light of the world, where does the light shine? In darkness. So we are called to go to dark places, but we are called to be equipped when we go into dark places. And as our children go into schools, have conversations and all that, they need to be equipped with these information. And where must it come from? It must come from the family. It must come from us. It must come from the church. It must come from, godly people and influence around them. And so, your question on worldview, Sherman, I think it's so important. We went to the zoo because my eldest birthday was like 2 weeks ago. And went to the zoo and we saw the pandas. And, the pandas, the Jaja and Kai Kai, right, were in different enclosures. So my 6-year-old asked, Mama, why they cannot stay together? They are a family, right? That's so cruel. They split the pandas apart. And I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't even think of that. So just nice, there was a zookeeper next to us. And so I asked the zookeeper, can you share with me why the pandas are in different enclosures? So she shared with me and she said that, because they're quite territorial and they will actually attack each other, except during mating time, we will put them together. And the zoo trip sparked a conversation with my 6-year-old, my 4-year-old on what is mating. And so, what is mating? Why mating happen only can be together? And we had that conversation on on sex, essentially with our 4-year-old and a 6-year-old while walking the zoo. And the whole point is to make it a common conversation. It's not a taboo, like, don't ask me, or mating is mating. And this is not going to be the first time or the only time we're going to talk about this. But if our children can ask, we can answer. I remember we were cycling with our kids one day, and that's when my 9-year-old said, he saw a pregnant woman as we were cycling. How did the baby come out of the mama? And that's just sparked a conversation on the bikes. And I was just sharing how he was born. And I think it's important for us to, not put it in a worldview to say, you must speak of it in apologetics or, quote all these verses. I mean, that's good and important, but to have a running conversation with our children, to have the power of first mention so that they are equipped when they go into the world. Why do they feel a child in the womb is alive? Why do they feel that a father and mother are necessary in a family? Why do they feel that a marriage is a man and a woman? And so on and so forth. So I think with the cultural influence that we have, the world is getting darker, yes, but the question is our light also getting dimmer? While the world is getting darker, and if our light is dimming even faster, really, we cannot just blame the world, but we need to look back at ourselves and what are we doing as the light of the world. Yeah.
I feel so challenged, that we just listening to you. I think we all absolutely agree that conversations have got to continue. I remember just watching recently a street evangelist was just asking questions to some of the people he was meeting. And one of the questions was this, and was really in your face kind. So he went up to a woman and he said this, please complete the sentence for me. It is okay to kill a baby in the womb when... And she was flabbergasted. She didn't know how to answer it. So really, these kind of conversations have got to really carry on. I know we absolutely agree with that, the power of first mention and all. Debbie, I got one final question for you. What has God laid upon your heart for this current season? And for this time, what is on your heart that the Lord has placed on you?
There's one big piece that the Lord has kind of shown us some glimpses of what's on his heart. I think children is a very big piece. He has given this, I guess, heart for children to Norm and myself. particularly looking into really the voice of children. Again, like we spoke of many things earlier, but what are those cultural influence and what is the impact to children? For example, when we speak about divorce, many times divorce happens because two adults, right? The husband and the wife have a problem, have an issue, and so on and so forth, and then they decide to have a divorce. Now, what happens if there is a child in this family unit? I would say majority of the times, the child is actually not even considered, in terms of not considered to say, not that they don't consider the well-being of the child, but rather the voice of the child, the perception from the child's perspective may not always be considered, right? Many times the decisions are made by the adults with the, of course, with the angle or with the heart of this is what they feel is best for the child. But really, sometimes I think we can take a step back. You know, what does a child feel when he or she has to go to one parent's house to stay for 3 days a week and another parent's house to stay for 4 days a week, to have dual school bags in 2 houses, to have to remember this Sunday, which house am I going to celebrate a birthday with 2 sides of the family, and so on and so forth. You know, for children who are abused, you know, what is their voice behind that? For children, I mean, when I read of stories in other countries when same-sex marriage is being put in place, the child often in that situation as a young child does not actually have a voice in a sense to say, I don't want to be in a family where it's 2 moms or 2 dads. I want to have a dad and a mom, as in a biological dad and a mom. But because of a decision of an adult or adults, sometimes the child's point of view is not yet really fully factored in. And so it's really a work that a thought that the Lord has placed in our hearts, you know, the voice of children, the rights of children. Many times we fight for the rights of men and women and adults and even animal rights, right? But has anyone thought about the right of a child? You know, the child in the womb, the child who is born, the child of a marriage and is broken. So the voice and really the identity of a child is something that the Lord is, I think, slowly revealing to Norm and myself. And what can we do to speak up for children, whether they are, you know, in the womb, whether they are children in vulnerable situation, whether they're children who are placed in situations where it's not of their own preference or even not of their own decision or choice. Yes, there is a point of view where, but you know, they're children, they don't understand, they're not of a certain age and so on and so forth. That into consideration, but sometimes I think the purity of a child, right? The Lord says, right, the faith of a child, you know, if you can behave like a child and have that. And so there is, I think, that purity of a child's mind, a child's heart, a child's emotion, that we really need to spend time to look into a lot more and speak up for children and allow children to have that voice. So it is really in seed form. So I'm not entirely cohesive, but I think speaking about the rights of children, the voice of children, speaking up for children is something that the Lord has shown on our radar in the coming season. And like I said earlier, you know, the entire conversation on generations and how we're not just raising our children or the children of 2022, you know, or even the next 10, 20 years, but the children's children and children after that. That the work that we do will always be for the generations, that whatever work that we do now is going to be something that will, in 50 years time, in 60, 70 years time, they would be able to say, I live in a society where it is good because the ones before me have done a foundation, have built a foundation where we can thrive. And I think we say that of our forefathers, and we need to make sure that we're doing that for the generations after us as well.
Thank you, Debbie. That is such a rich deposit, I would say, you know, to our hearts. I know Mario and me are very, very blessed, and I'm sure our audiences are very, very blessed as well. It's such a conversation of depth that we've had, the way I'll say it, you know, and I was so glad that you are able to spend your time with us today, and we are so blessed, and we want to thank you for being here and sharing your heart in such an authentic and real manner, and yet in a very vulnerable way, sharing those anecdotes that you did. So Debbie, thank you so much for being with us. We're so glad, and we hope that you can join us again at some point in time down the road to further the conversation, because I feel like there's so much more that you have to give, and our audiences will be so blessed by what you can provide. So thank you so much, Debbie, once again. And to our audiences, we hope that you are very, very enriched by this session that we have, this episode that we have today. And we hope that you continue to stay tuned to more upcoming episodes along the way as we continue to talk about the worldview that God has for us in business, in media, in family. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for staying tuned and tune into the next podcast as well. Thank you so much, Mario. Thanks, Sherman, for having me.
Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you. Thanks, Debbie, for coming on.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for joining us in this episode of the Telos podcast. Always remember your reason for being. See you at the next episode.